Study Session 3, The History and Development of Juvenile Justice. Introduction. Until recently, delinquent, neglected, and runaway children were treated the same as adult criminal offenders. Menel, 1972. They were convicted of crimes. They received harsh sentences similar to those imposed on adults. The Adult Criminal Code applied to children, and no juvenile court existed. We will therefore attempt to explore how juvenile justice system developed in this study session. Learning outcomes. When you have studied this session, you should be able to 1. Discuss the events that led to the development of juvenile justice system. 1. Development of the juvenile justice system. Several events led to reforms and nourished the eventual development of the juvenile justice system in the 19th century. These events include urbanization, child-saving movement, house of refuge, development of juvenile institution, Children's Aid Society, and Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children. They are briefly discussed as follows. 1. Urbanization. Urbanization gave rise to increased numbers of young people at risk, who overwhelmed the existing system of work and training. To accommodate destitute youths, local jurisdictions developed poor houses, alms houses, and work houses. The poor, the insane, the diseased, and vagrant and destitute children were housed there in crowded and unhealthy conditions. By the late 18th century, the family's ability to exert control over children began to be questioned. Villages developed into urban commercial centers, and work began to center around factories. Not the home. Children of destitute families left home or were cast loose to make out as best as they could. Wealthy families could no longer absorb vagrant youth as representatives or servants. The affluent began to voice concern over the increase in the number of people in what they considered the dangerous classes, that is, the poor, single, criminal, mentally ill, and unemployed. Menel, 1983. Urbanization and industrialization also generated the belief that certain segments of the population, youths in urban areas, immigrants, were susceptible to influences of their decaying environment. The children of these classes were considered a group that might be saved by a combination of state and community intervention. Platt, 1969. Intervention in the lives of these so-called dangerous classes became acceptable for wealthy, civic-minded citizens. Such efforts include settlement houses, a term used around the turn of the 20th century to describe shelters or non-secure residential facilities for vagrant children. Child-saving movement. The problems generated by urban growth sparked interest in the welfare of the new Americans, whose arrival fueled this expansion. In 1816, prominent New Yorkers formed the Society for the Prevention of Pauperism. Although they concerned themselves with attacking taverns, brothels, and gambling parlors, they were concerned that the moral training of children of the dangerous classes was inadequate. Some other groups with the plight of poor children began to form. Their focus was on extending government control over youthful activities, drinking, vagrancy, and delinquency that had previously been left to private or family control. These activists became known as child savers. Prominent among them were penologist Enoch Wines, George Richard Tutil, Sarah Cooper of the National Conference of Charities and Corrections, and Sophia Minton of New York Committee on Children. Poor children could become a financial burden, and the child savers believed these children presented a threat to the moral fabric of society. Child-saving organizations influence state legislatures to enact laws giving courts the power to commit children who were runaways or criminal offenders to specialized institutions. NUPFA 2001. 1.3 House of Refuge. This is a care facility developed by the child savers to protect potential criminal youths by taking them off the street and providing a family-like environment. The first house of refuge constructed in New York City was the product of their reform efforts. The reformatory opened January 1, 1825, with only 6 boys and 3 girls. But within the first decade of its operation, 1,678 inmates were admitted. Most kids were sent there because of vagrancy and petty crimes and were sentenced or committed indefinitely until they reached adulthood. Most kids were sent there because of vagrancy and petty crimes and were sentenced or committed indefinitely until they reached adulthood. When the House of Refuge opened, the majority of children admitted were status offenders placed there because of vagrancy or neglect. Children were placed in the institution by court order, sometimes over parents' objections. Their length of stay depended on need, age, and skill. Critics complained that the institution was run like a prison, with strict discipline and absolute separation of the sexes. Such a harsh program drove many children to run away, and the House of Refuge was forced to take a more lenient approach. In 1826, the Boston City Council founded the House of Reformation for juvenile offenders. The courts committed children found guilty of criminal violations or found to be beyond the control of their parents. To these schools, Pickett, 1969. Since the child savers considered parents of delinquent children to be as guilty as convicted offenders, they sought to have the reform schools establish control over the children. Refuge managers believed they were preventing poverty and crime by separating destitute and delinquent children from their parents and placing them in an institution. Menel, 1972. Despite ongoing criticism and scandal, the houses of refuge hung on for more than 100 years. 1.4 Development of juvenile institutions. State intervention in the lives of children continued well into the 20th century. The child savers influenced state and local governments to create special institutions called reform schools, which would house delinquent youths who would have otherwise been sent to adult prisons. The first institutions were opened in Westboro, Massachusetts, in 1848 and in Rochester, New York in 1949. U.S. Department of Justice, Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention, 1976. However, institutional programs began in Ohio in 1850 and in Maine, Rhode Island, and Michigan in 1906. In New York, for example, the legislature authorized a state training for boys at Warwick for inmates under 16 and the state vocational school at Coxsackie for those 16 to 19, New York State Law, 1932. Children spend their days working in the institution, learning a trade where possible, and receiving some basic education. They were radically and sexually segregated. Discipline was harsh, and their physical care was poor. Some were labeled as criminal, but were in reality abused and neglected. They too were subject to harsh working conditions, strict discipline, and intensive labor. Smith, 1989. Although some people viewed reform schools as humanitarian answers to poorhouses and prisons, many were opposed to such programs. 1.5. Children's Aid Society. This is an alternative to secure correctional facilities, which New York philanthropist Charles Loring Brace helped develop in 1853. Brace's formula for dealing with delinquent youth was to rescue them from the harsh environment of the city and provide them with temporary shelter. Fox, 1996. Deciding there were simply too many needy children to care for in New York City and believing the urban environment was injurious to children, Brace devised what he called his placing out plan to send these children to Western farms where they could be cared for and find a home. They were placed on what became known as orphan trains, which made pre-announced stops in Western farming communities. Brace's plan was activated in 1854 and was very soon copied by other child care organizations. Though the majority of the children benefited from the plan and did find a new life, others were less successful and some were exploited and harmed by the experience. By 1930, political opposition to Brace's plan, coupled with the negative effects of the economic depression, spelled the end of the orphan train, but not before 150,000 children were placed in rural homesteads. 1.6. Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children, SPCC. First established in 1874 in New York, these organizations protected children subjected to cruelty and neglect at home or at school. Agents of the society were granted power to remove children from their homes and arrest anyone who interfered with their work. They also assisted the court in making placement decisions. By 1890, the society controlled the intake and disposition of an average of 15,000 poor and neglected children. By 1900, there were 300 such societies in the United States. Plek, 1987. Leaders of the SPCCs were concerned that abused boys would become lower-class criminals and that mistreated young girls might become sexually promiscuous women. In addition, these organizations protected children who had been subjected to cruelty and neglect at home and at school. SPCC groups influenced state legislatures to pass statutes protecting children from parents who did not provide them with adequate food and clothing, or made them beg or work in places where liquor was sold. Criminal penalties were created for negligent parents. SPCC groups would also inform the police about suspected abuse cases and accompany officers when they made an arrest. Gordon, 1988. Study session summary. In this study session, we describe the history and development of the juvenile justice system, several events that led to reforms and nourished the eventual development of the juvenile justice system in the 19th century are also explained. These events include urbanization, child-saving movement, house of refuge, development of juvenile institutions, Children's Aid Society, and Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children. End of study session 3. Thank you for listening.